We're looking at the last two chapters of the beginning beekeeper course. And chapter 9 is about preparing for overwintering, seeing the results in the spring. And the first picture that we have up here is on the left is actually some beehives that are set up with a windscreen in the back made of pallets. So people come up with lots of really cool ways of making windscreens and trying to protect their bees. And on the right here, there's some hives here. I wish I could totally minimize it. There we go. And on the right-hand side picture, there's a series of hives here, and it's showing the beekeeper, working them, towards spring, and there's a shim here on this one above the two deep hive bodies, and they're just doing some work there, taking those shims out and checking the food stores, and you can see jars here that tells me they're getting ready for some spring feeding, most likely for this particular case. So this is addressing what we do fall into winter with our honeybee hives. So if you decide to harvest honey, which you're not required to, most of us like to because we like honey, but we want to make sure that we leave enough honey in that hive so that the honeybees have plenty to eat and carry them through the winter. We're really actually robbing from them, so we don't want to take more than we should so that they can have what they need. So once you've done your harvest, which should be done by September at the latest, you want to look over your hives, see how they're doing, see how many bees are in there, see how much brood babies, eggs have been laid, and you want to move the brood frames to the bottom of the hive if they're not already there, and put the honey stores up on the top hive body in a Langstroth hive. So what most people keep bees in this area. So probably the standard type hive. And the recommendation is that you have a minimum of 8 frames of bees brood and 8 frames of stores at least. And you can weigh your hive to give you another way to kind of check and make sure you've got enough in there. So about 100 to 120 pounds going into fall, into winter. And the other thing that we really want to make sure of after we harvest our honey is to treat for varroa mites, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter, in chapter 10. The other thing after you harvest that you want to really keep track of is you want to remove any of the partially filled supers that you might have left on the hive after harvesting. So the supers are not quite as deep, and those are usually the frames that we extract honey from. And then after we extract, a lot of beekeepers will put them back on the hive to let the bees clean them out and get honey from them. So if you did that, you'll want to pull them off before you go into winter. And you also want to be keeping track of supplemental feeding. Sometimes in the fall for us in Eastern Washington, in this general area, things get pretty dry. And so even though there may be still some flowering plants, some flowers that the bees may be visiting, they may not be getting much nectar from those plants. So you might have to start feeding your hives a little earlier than you normally would have anticipated. And it really varies year to year. So if you find when you open your hive as you're getting things prepared for fall, and you look in there and you think, there's not a whole lot of bees in here, there's not very much brood, in this hive, what am I going to do? If you have more than one hive, you can do a couple of things. You know, because a hive with not very many bees in it is probably not going to survive the winter. So we suggest that you try to merge the colonies. So kind of depends on what you have and the mix of you know, bees you have. If you have a really strong hive and you have a weak hive, you can put them together. If you have 2 weak hives, you can actually put those together and see if you can make one complete hive out of the 2. So if you're going to do that with the 2 weak hives, if you can, you'd remove that queen from the weak hive. If you can't, not to worry. If you can't find it, you'll want to place the hive with the most brood on the bottom box and then put the weaker hive on the top box. And then you'll put a piece of newspaper between the 2 of them. And the bees have to work and chew through that to eventually merge together and become one colony. So after about 2 weeks, you'll take a look, see how they're doing. You can reallocate the frames so that the brood is all on the bottom and the stores are on the top. So all this to say that all is not lost if you have a weak hive. You can either put the weak one with the strong one or put 2 weak ones together. But all of it thinking ahead to the winter time when they need to be able to be strong enough to survive. And usually the queen in the top hive will be the one that survives if you don't remove one of the queens ahead of time. So just informational there. So any questions so far?
I don't have any on chat.
Okay. All right. So one of the other things we recommend is that you definitely treat for varroa mites going into the winter. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 10 because we have lots of wonderful things to talk about pests and beasts and all kinds of stuff. So, but this picture here on the left is actually a person who is treating their hive with oxalic acid. And a lot of folks use the vaporization method. So that's a little vaporization wand, and this is a battery. It needs some electricity to heat it up so it can vaporize inside of the hive. So again, we'll talk about that more in the next chapter. A little picture of how that wand looks when you stick it into the hive and actually do the vaporization process. So very important to, again, what we want that hive to be as healthy as possible going into fall winter. We were talking a little bit earlier about supplemental feeding. The feeding that you want to give the bees, you know, late fall, is a sugar syrup liquid with it, which is 2 to 1. So 2 parts sugar, 1 part water, until the daytime temperature is consistently below 50, 60 degrees. So as long as we, you know, if we have like kind of a fairly warm fall, you can keep giving them the sugar syrup. You may have to start it a little earlier than you thought you would. Sometimes I have to start it in August because of my area where I have bees, if we have a really dry year. And then the winter feed is solid feed. And so kind of the 3 main ones that we see people use is something called candy board, fondant, or good old granulated sugar. And I'm kind of a granulated sugar fan because it also acts as a bit of a desiccant. It actually absorbs some moisture inside of the hive during the winter, in addition to giving some supplemental feeding. And of course, we always want there to be as much honey as possible for the bees to access. So, you know, honey is always the best. Some people only give or use honey. They don't give put anything else in during the winter, and they, you know, when it's warm enough, they try to put in some more frames. They have what they call a honey bank. Just kind of depends on what people want to do, but you definitely have, I think around here, I would say rule of thumb is you need to have some supplemental feed in that hive for the winter time. And there are recipes for the candy board and the fondant in the appendix of your book. Also, there's tons of stuff online and lots of books out there that talk about all kinds of mixtures. I think you had some information in your book about some things you don't want to give bees, like brown sugar and molasses, stuff like that. So stick with the basics. And then the other big piece that we need to really be conscious of in a hive is going into winter is the moisture control aspect. So I talked a little bit about the sugar, granulated sugar actually kind of absorbs some moisture, and it actually kind of cakes up, and so that's actually not a bad thing. A lot of folks, or the recommendation is to add what we call a shim to the top of the hive with an absorbent material. So in this picture on the left, where I've got the little pointer right now, that's actually a little rectangle that someone built, and then they put some burlap in here in the bottom, and you can put on that burlap some kind of desiccant agent, some agent to absorb moisture. So some people use actually a baby diaper. A lot of people use dry maple leaves. So, there's various things you can put in, and it doesn't have to be like chock full, but you just put some things on the top to help absorb moisture over the winter time. So that's an option that you can use. You want to make sure that there are top and bottom entrances to the hive. If most people that I've run across around here tend to use a screened bottom board, and they use it summer and winter. But if you have a solid bottom board, the bottom piece is all solid, you can use that. You just want to tip the hive slightly so that the entrance is, so the back is a little higher than the front, so that if there's moisture, it can run out of the hive and not sit in there and pool. Some folks too will also, if you look here on the right, there's they actually use just one of their supers on top, and that gives enough room so that you can see the supplemental feeding here where the pointer is, and all the bees are around it. So that's just granulated sugar on a paper towel. And then they put that shim on, like one of your supers on top, so there's room so the bees can get in there. And you can also add this piece if you choose to absorb some moisture. So again, the biggest piece, and this is for Langstroth hive, so the pretty traditional hive. So this is basically, doing two things. It's providing some moisture control, and it's giving enough room to put the supplemental feeding out there for the bees, in addition to however many frames of honey you have available in there for them to be able to eat. Okay, and another very important aspect to winter beekeeping, especially in this area, is protection from wind and weather. And I'm kind of personally thinking that almost wind is almost harder than actually like snow on bees, but the jury's still out. I'm still trying to figure out the magical combination. So as much as we talked to you probably at the beginning of this course, you had someone talk to you about how you look for a good spot to put your beehive in the spring when you're starting your process of raising bees. And so as important as it is to pick a good spot in the spring, it's also sometimes a good idea to think about relocating your hive for the winter. And so to protect it from the wind and the weather. So you don't always have to do that. If you can put in some kind of a windbreak, some people use straw bales. You can see this picture. They used pallets. That was really creative to kind of form a break. Sometimes people have natural barriers like, trees or something like that. You can use pieces of plywood. There's all kinds of ideas. Some people have actually used outbuildings to put their hives in for the winter. That's totally fine. You don't want to put them anywhere heated because you don't want the bees to decide, oh, now we can fly and we're gonna, start making brood. It's not the right time of the year for them to be doing that kind of work because they won't have anything. They don't have any pollen or nectar to get. So don't put them somewhere heated. If it snows, you want to make sure that the entranceway of the hive is cleared of snow, and it will build up snow. So if that, in some ways, like for me, it's nice to move them closer to the house in a spot I have sheltered between two buildings, and then I remember more often, oh, go out there, double check, if they're farther out in the field, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. So it depends on how you want to do it, but definitely remove snow buildup from the entrance. And the other thing you want to do throughout the winter is that it is normal. Obviously, bees die off during the winter. And so they'll drop down to the bottom of the hive, and they can actually clog up that opening of the hive. So periodically you should go in there with your hive tool, or I have a stick or a kind of a board that fits the right slot to get in there and clear out the dead bees. But that helps keep them, they tend to be kind of moist, and first year I raised bees, I didn't realize that, and they were all moldy in the bottom. So lesson learned there. So it's good to clean them out, gets the air circulation going, which is good for keeping the moisture down, and also lets the bees be able to get out and fly if it warms up enough during the winter days, because we do have days where it gets in the 50s and they will decide to get out and fly a little bit. So this bottom picture, actually, it's kind of hard to see, but there's some yellow droppings on the snow, and those are happening because the bees are just out for the day flying, and they're doing their little pooping and peeing outside. So so it's good if they can get out and fly and go to the bathroom. So this is just a picture of this looks like this looks like maybe it's a top bar hive there, and it's a snowy day, so just how they have them set up. But probably checking hives to make sure entrances are okay and that they can get in and out. So I'll just pause for a minute. Any questions?
I was going to say, should we mention that in the winter time, I don't know if anybody else does it, but I do it. I put a restrictor on the bottom so they just have a place to come out and go potty.
Yeah,
so the wind doesn't swoosh in there.
Yeah, you definitely can do that. And I think we talk in the next chapter about a mouse guard for mice problems. So yeah, you definitely can, do a restrictor. There's a lot online about how, and we talk in our club about what different people have done in different situations as far as adding insulation to the outside of the hive. And I think honestly the jury may be kind of out on how that works. It seems to work for some people, not so much for others, some years better than others. So all that just
humidity, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to be kind of careful when you start insulating the outside, because that can cause more moisture inside. So it's kind of like your regular house. You don't want it so tightly sealed up that, it can't breathe and it can't have air circulation. So yeah. All right. Anybody else?
I have no questions here.
Okay. All right. So you've probably heard about this, even if outside of a beekeeping class, but people talk about the cluster of bees when it gets cold. the cluster of bees that happens during the wintertime, it shrinks and expands based on the temperature. And that's as in the temperature outside. So the temperature inside the hive is the same as the outside temperature. It isn't like bees can heat up 2 hive boxes, and heat the whole inside of the hive. And sometimes when you read about them, it kind of makes, sometimes some literature or some things that are written makes it sound like they just do all this great heating. They do for their cluster, but not the whole hive itself. And the other thing is that they choose where they want to make that cluster inside of the hive. So it's not necessarily in the center of a hive box. It can be on one side or the other. I mean, they know what they need to do. So don't expect, that a hive will always have a cluster in exactly the center of the hive. The lowest temperature that a colony can survive depends on several factors. The number of bees that are present, because the more bees, the bigger the cluster, the more they have to keep the more bees they have, more bee people they have to keep warm. The quantity of the stores that are available for them to eat, and the duration of how long it's cold, because the longer it stays cold, the longer they stay clustered. If it starts to warm up, then you'll hear the term break the cluster. They can break out of that cluster, and then they can start foraging for food farther away from their cluster of bees. So bees start to cluster at about 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And the mantle, the outside temperature, they usually try to keep it about 48 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the core temperature ranges 64 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, just stressing that fact that they're only heating themselves, they're not heating their whole hive. The cluster itself must always be in contact with the stores. So if it gets super, super cold and they eat everything in that area of the cluster, they will starve, because they will not be able to break their cluster to go out and forage in other spots of the hive, which is kind of sad, because we feel bad. We're like, we put all this stuff in there for you to eat, and they didn't eat it, So the bees in the core, they're the ones that are moving around and caring for the queen and any brood. So there's, they've all got, and then the outside bees rotate with the inner bees, and that is based on hunger, not temperature. And they're able to average about 8 days in the mantle, and then up to 16 days with a full honey stomach. So they have a very methodical way of how they take care of the queen and keep the center warm, and how they access food. And some of it is just hard because we can't control the weather. So, hopefully we have enough warm days and cold days that they don't have a long stretch where it's so cold they can't get out and get a little bit of food. And this picture, actually where the pointer is just showing a thermal image of a hive. And you can see that a lot of this hive is pretty cold. And then there's this area that's warmer, and that's probably where there's some bees. So.
Okay. Marie, I have a question.
Sure, go for it.
And I would put it in, but I don't know how to type it out. So I can
That's
just
okay.
say it. As a brand new person, I would get nervous in the middle of winter. Do they have enough solid feed still? Or do they need more? But I would also be nervous about opening up. You don't want to open it up.
Said you can put it in. They may not use it. It's wherever they cluster at.
I know.
But
as a nervous Nelly, you don't want to keep opening up and looking at things.
No.
Yes,
I'll
please.
slap your hand.
Michael's like, I'm gonna slap your hand.
Oh, don't do that.
Time.
Yeah, but it is true. If the temperature is not in the upper 50s, don't open that hive. You definitely don't want to open it enough that you're like taking off the covers and looking. Sometimes you can kind of do a quick little peek under it, but every time you do anything like that, you run the risk of chilling that ball of, those bees that are in there. And if you chill them, they may not be able to recover from that. So you kind of have to go on faith and hope that you've got enough in there. And then the other piece to it is if you have the opportunity, because we do sometimes have days that get fairly warm even in the winter. If you have a day like that, take the opportunity and get in there, and take a peek. But you definitely don't want to be pulling out any frames.
Right.
Don't do anything like that. Yeah.
So if we had a particularly cold, long winter, which I haven't had yet, it's usually just February, but if we did for some reason, just leave them alone.
Just
Don't worry
leave
about
them.
it, just leave it alone.
You just have to do the best you can and hope for the best for them. Yeah. Yeah. So that, and unfortunately, if it stays cold for that long period of time and they don't break that cluster, it wouldn't matter how much food you put in there because they can't go and get it from the other part of the hive.
Okay.
Sadly, unfortunately, that's just kind of how it is. So
thank you.
Yeah, but that's a good question. And I do that too. I get really worried about it. Do they have enough? Should I put more in? Did they not put enough in to start with? So, yeah. Okay. So in the spring, once we truly get into spring itself, you're going to start looking at a couple things. You're going to look and see, are the bees starting to fly out of the hive? Are you seeing them flying around? At that point, you could consider checking to see if they need some more feed. But again, now they're saying don't open them until 60. I was saying upper 50s, but yeah, you definitely don't want to pull out any frames until they're at least 60 degrees. You check to make sure, and at that point you could see it's the end of the winter. Do I need to start giving them some feed? If you're getting over 60 degrees, you could go ahead and be giving them liquid feed, once it gets warmer in the spring and it's not freezing. You might want to consider adding a pollen supplement, which is basically some protein for them. Again, don't pull those frames out until it's at least 60. And oftentimes what happens during the winter is that the bees move up into that upper Langstroth box. So you'll have, your 2 deep boxes that have your frames in them, and they'll go from the bottom up to the top. And then, so what you'll want to do is just switch the boxes and put the top box at the bottom and the bottom box at the top. So, those are things you want to start thinking about once we get a sustained, true spring and it's warm and it's not, temperatures aren't dropping down. So, unfortunately, even though, and I will preface this whole, I really should have prefaced this at the beginning of this whole chapter. So you can do every single thing, and unfortunately, the hive will not make it through the winter. And I think you have to be realistic about the expectation is that you may need to buy bee packages every year, or find a swarm, or, if a club is selling some bees from a split or something like that. But some people have great luck with wintering over bees. It seems to vary from year to year, from place to place. So if you lose a bee colony, a hive, it's not necessarily that you did anything wrong. It's just that there were factors that you couldn't control. So the one thing that is important to do if you open up your hive in the spring and you find out, oh, they did not make it, is really is good to try to figure out what happened in the hive so that you can keep track of it and then decide, try to fix that for next year when for the next hive that you start to raise, if you decide to do that. So they can die from starvation. And over here on the top right hand where there's the pointers kind of wiggling around, if you see open cells with the little bottom sticking out, that means they died of starvation. So they just couldn't move and they ate everything in that area. You can have them die, as we were talking about, lack of moisture control, because you've probably already heard this. A wet bee is a dead bee. So we don't want wet drippy stuff on bees. This picture down below is showing what I believe to be a bunch of sugar, and it looks kind of wet and goopy, and you can see the paper towel it's on around it looks wet. And so all those bees that are dead there just probably were soaked with moisture. Sometimes it's because they die because you just don't have enough bees in there. So too few bees in the colony. If you have a really light winter and it doesn't get super cold, you might make it through. The next year, you might have a colony that doesn't have very many bees and they don't make it. So if you open the hive too much, so don't open the hive for the person that asked previously. So unless it's definitely warm enough to do so. And then varroa mites can take over the hive and can cause losses. So that's very realistic problem that we have. Going back to the part about not enough bees, if you don't have enough bees in that hive, then there's not enough bees in the cluster to keep the temperature up for them. So they really are dependent on not only having enough food and enough ventilation, and they're also dependent on just the number of bees that are there. And then you have to think about how you're going to go forward, if your if your hive did not survive. And so do you want to replace bees? So then you kind of have to decide, do you want to order more bees? And there are various people locally you can order from. There's also people online that sometimes you can get a queen from if you need to requeen. So some people, actually, we have people that just depend on catching swarms during the summer. So you get free bees if you catch a swarm. So it just kind of depends how you want to do it. So, what kind of bee? Do you want a Carniolan bee? Do you want the Italian bee? Do you want to try for Caucasians or something more exotic? There's some debate about how much bees are really different because we haven't had much diversity in the US, but there's that option. And then how many hives do you want to have? So you have to be realistic about that too. And one thing we're really noticing is that sometimes people want to have a lot of hives on their property because they're thinking, because it makes sense in a way, I want 5 hives because I want to be able to get a good amount of honey harvested off of that. But if you have 5 hives, but you don't have enough pollinator plants for those hives, they're not going to do well, and they potentially won't be very strong hives and probably won't survive. So be realistic about what you have natively and what you plant that the bees could access for food on wherever you want to place your hive. And then do you know what happened to the colony that died? So that's when you do that look and you say, oh, is it because they ran out of food in the spot they were in? Was it because it was super cold and they couldn't break the cluster? Was it wet? Whatever it was that might have happened. And then that's why it's important to keep a bee journal. So just keep a journal of what you do from year to year so that you can kind of keep track of it, go back and look, based on your findings, then make decisions about your next steps for the following year. And I would just add to this piece, talk to experienced beekeepers. You might be able to have someone come out and look at the hive with you and give you some tips or suggestions, or you could take some photos of them and send them. Or that's why being part of a club like West Plains Beekeepers is helpful, because you can talk to other folks and just say, hey, this is what I noticed. Did anybody else notice this year? Those are all great ways to, kind of figure out what's going on and kind of think about your next steps for following year. So that's the end of this chapter. So any questions? before we would move forward?
I don't think, no. I don't have any here.
All right. Well, I'm switching over. If somebody
Okay.
comes up with a question, let me know. So I'm
Well,
going
I
to
might make a comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. In the fall, if you move once it's getting cold, don't move your hives because the bees, you can break the cluster and cause problems with the bees at that point. So be proactive. Get your things, what you want done, like moving the hives to a different spot or someplace like that before it gets cold. And you know, it can get chilly, but it's warm enough in the daytime for the bees to recluster and reorient themselves. But just be a little bit careful about moving hives in the winter. And another thing, another tale, I have a tale to tell you. I had a friend whose hives got knocked over on a snowy day by a moose, rubbing its butt up against the hives. And he came home and found all of his bees spilled in the snow. He put them back together as best he could, and they survived the winter. So try things.
Oh, you mean all I have to do is dump them in the snow? Well, geez.
Well, just, you know, whatever you're faced with,